At 1:30 a.m. on December 25, 1945, a house in Fayetteville, West Virginia, began to burn. Inside were George and Jenny Sodder and 9 of their 10 children. When the fire was extinguished hours later, the house was gone, reduced to a smoldering basement filled with ash. 4 of the children had escaped with their parents. The other 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were unaccounted for. No physical remains were ever recovered from the site. Their death certificates list the cause as fire or suffocation, but for the rest of their lives, their parents maintained that the children did not die that night. The central question of the Sodder case is not simply what happened, but whether 5 children could vanish from a fire without a trace. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant, born Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia, in 1895. He arrived in the United States at the age of 13 and eventually found work in the coal fields of West Virginia. He was, by all accounts, a hard-working and opinionated man, unafraid to voice his strong criticisms of the fascist government of Benito Mussolini. This often put him at odds with other members of the Italian immigrant community in Fayetteville. His wife, Jenny Cipriani, was also of Italian descent, the daughter of a local shopkeeper. Together, they built a life and a large family, residing in a 2-story timber frame house just outside of town. By 1945, they had 10 children, and George ran a successful coal trucking business. Fayetteville in the winter of 1945 was a community celebrating the end of a long war. The Sodder family was no different. On Christmas Eve, their second eldest son, Joe, was home from his service in the Army. The eldest daughter, 17-year-old Marion, had returned from her job at a dime store with gifts for her younger siblings. 5 of the children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty asked their mother if they could stay up later than usual to play with their new toys. Jenny agreed, reminding them to do their chores, such as feeding the cows and chickens, before they went to bed in the attic room they shared. The older sons, 23-year-old John and 16-year-old George Jr., were tired from a day of work and went to bed early. George and Jenny Sodder retired around 10 p.m. with their youngest child, 2-year-old Sylvia. The quiet of the evening was first disturbed at approximately 12:30 a.m. The telephone rang, and Jenny went downstairs to answer it. The caller was a woman whose voice she did not recognize, asking for a name she did not know. Jenny informed the woman she had the wrong number. She would later recall hearing loud laughter and the clinking of glasses in the background, as if from a party. The woman on the line gave what Jenny described as a weird, mocking laugh before hanging up. After the call, Jenny noted that the lights were still on and the front door was unlocked. Marion had fallen asleep on the living room couch. Assuming the other children were in their attic bedroom, Jenny turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned upstairs. On her way back to bed, she heard another sound, a loud thump on the roof, followed by what sounded like an object rolling down. She paid it little mind and went back to sleep. This was at approximately 1 a.m. 30 minutes later, she woke again, this time to the smell of smoke. The room George used as an office was on fire. The family's home was located just over 2 miles from the Fayetteville Fire Department. The context of George Sodder's business and personal life also provides a frame for the events. Months prior to the fire, an insurance salesman had visited the home. When George declined to purchase a policy, the man reportedly became angry, warning him that his goddamn house is going up in smoke and his children are going to be destroyed. The salesman attributed this threat to George's dirty remarks about Mussolini. George dismissed the interaction at the time. This same salesman would later be selected to serve on the coroner's jury that investigated the fire. At 1:30 a.m. on December 25th, the Sodder house was burning. Jenny woke her husband, and they quickly got their youngest daughter, Sylvia, out of the bedroom. They shouted for their other children. John and George Jr. woke and fled their downstairs bedroom. Marianne, asleep on the couch, was woken by her mother and escaped. The 4 surviving children and their parents gathered outside in the freezing night air. They looked to the attic windows, expecting to see the faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. They saw nothing but smoke and flames. George Sodder immediately tried to re-enter the house to reach the attic, where the children slept. The main staircase, however, was already engulfed in fire, its passage completely blocked. He ran outside, intending to use a heavy ladder that he always kept propped against the side of the house. From this ladder, he could access the children's window directly. But when he went to its usual spot, the ladder was gone. He and his older sons searched the immediate area in the darkness, but it could not be located. His next plan involved his 2 coal trucks. He intended to drive one of them up to the side of the house and climb on top of it to reach the second-story window. He ran to the first truck and tried to start the engine. It would not turn over. He tried the second truck. It also failed to start. Both vehicles had been running perfectly the previous day. The family was left without any means to reach the upper floor. Further attempts to fight the blaze were also met with failure. A water barrel that the family kept for such emergencies was found to be frozen solid. The home's telephone line was dead. Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. When the neighbor tried the operator, there was no response. Another neighbor, seeing the blaze from the nearby highway, drove to a tavern and tried to place a call from there, also without success. The town's fire alert system relied on a telephone tree, where one firefighter would call another. Without a working phone line, it was useless. Eventually, someone had to drive into Fayetteville to physically locate Fire Chief F.J. Morris. Due to the late hour and the holiday, it took time to assemble a crew. Chief Morris later explained that manpower was low because of the war, and that he himself could not drive the fire engine, requiring him to wait for another firefighter who could. For 45 minutes, the Sodders and their neighbors could do nothing but watch as the wooden house was consumed. The structure collapsed into its own basement, leaving a crater of burning timbers and ash. The fire department finally arrived at 8 a.m., more than 7 hours after the fire had started. By then, there was nothing left to save. A cursory search of the smoldering debris was conducted for the remains of the 5 missing children. Nothing was found. Chief Morris suggested that the fire had been hot enough to completely incinerate the bodies. The official report would later conclude the fire was accidental, caused by faulty electrical wiring. The Sodder family initially accepted this explanation. On December 30th, 5 death certificates were issued. In his grief, and wanting to create a memorial for his children, George Sodder brought in a bulldozer and covered the basement cavity with 5 feet of dirt. This act, born of despair, would become a point of contention for decades to come. In the weeks and months that followed, George and Jenny Sodder's grief began to mix with suspicion. They started to question the official narrative of an accidental fire. George pointed out that the family's Christmas lights had remained on during the early stages of the blaze, which seemed to contradict the theory of an electrical failure at the fuse box. A telephone repairman later confirmed that the Sodders' phone line had not been burned through, but appeared to have been deliberately cut at the pole. The missing ladder was eventually discovered, not misplaced, but thrown down a steep embankment approximately 75 feet from the house. These details led the Sodders to believe the fire was arson and that their children had been abducted. One theory posits that the Sicilian mafia was involved, possibly as retribution for George's refusal to be extorted or for his public criticism of Mussolini. The threat from the insurance salesman was seen as a potential key to this theory. The strange phone call, the disabled trucks, and the cut phone line were all presented as evidence of a coordinated, pre-planned attack. The family hired a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, who uncovered more unusual information. A bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve claimed to have seen people throwing balls of fire onto the roof of the Sodder home. Later, the youngest daughter, Sylvia, found a small, dark green, hard rubber object in the yard, which the family believed was the remnant of a pineapple-style hand grenade. Investigators considered the more conventional explanation that the children had perished and their remains were either missed or destroyed. According to this theory, the fire, fed by coal in the basement and the home's timber frame, could have reached temperatures high enough to calcify and disintegrate small bones. The fire department's 7-hour delay meant the blaze burned uncontrolled for an extended period. George Sodder's subsequent bulldozing of the site may have destroyed or buried any remaining fragments beyond recovery. The strange events, skeptics argue, could be coincidences magnified by the family's trauma. The trucks may have flooded in the haste to start them in the cold, and the cut phone line could have been the work of a local thief who later admitted to stealing a block and tackle from the property during the fire, claiming he cut the line thinking it was the power line. The investigation produced its own set of deeply strange events. Fire Chief Morris, years later, told George Sodder that he had, in fact, found something in the ashes, a human heart. He claimed he had buried it in a metal box at the site. When George had the box exhumed, its contents were examined by a local funeral director, who determined it was not a human heart, but fresh beef liver, completely untouched by fire. Morris later admitted he had fabricated the story and planted the liver, hoping that finding any remains would placate the family and close the case. This act only deepened the Sodders' mistrust of the official investigation. In 1949, George Sodder financed another excavation of the site. This time, several small bone fragments, identified as shards of human vertebrae, were discovered. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The resulting report concluded that the bones belonged to a single individual, likely aged between 16 and 22. They showed no signs of exposure to fire. The report suggested it was possible the bones had come from the dirt George used to fill the basement, which may have been sourced from a nearby cemetery. The age range did not match any of the missing children, with the oldest being 14. A more esoteric explanation suggests the children were taken and that evidence of their survival surfaced years later. There were several reported sightings. A woman who worked at a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, claimed to have seen the children in the company of 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction the week after the fire. In 1967, 22 years after the disappearance, Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his late 20s who bore a strong resemblance to her son, Louis. On the back of the photo was a cryptic handwritten note. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Illeal boys. A 90132. The family hired another private investigator to look into the lead, but he was never able to identify the man in the picture, and he subsequently vanished. The photograph became the family's most cherished piece of evidence. George Sodder died in 1969 and Jenny in 1989. Until their deaths, they maintained the billboard they had erected along Route 16, displaying the faces of their 5 missing children and offering a reward for information. The surviving Sodder children and their descendants have continued the search, but no conclusive evidence has ever emerged. The case remains open. The central conflict of facts persists, unresolved. Was it a series of unfortunate coincidences, a faulty wire, frozen equipment, a delayed response that led to an unimaginable tragedy, one which a grieving family could not accept? Or was it a carefully orchestrated crime, an act of arson designed to cover the abduction of 5 children who may have lived out their lives under different names, forever separated from their family? Without remains, without a confession, and without the children themselves, There are only the facts of the night and the questions that endure.